All right, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for tuning in. Casey Hendrickson here, and I'm sorry I'm a little bit late. I was on a conference call and had to get all of that taken care of. So I want to thank everybody for stopping by and joining us. I know it's a little bit later than it usually is. So we'll have some updates for everybody coming up in just a little bit on what is going to be happening for you premium subscribers out there who usually get your premium content Tuesday through Friday on Podbean. So got some pretty exciting developments on that coming up in just a little bit. But I wanted to just kind of talk about this. I'm not going to go into great detail about a lot of this stuff. And, I know that a lot of people are going to see some of the things that I have written, especially the title of this stream, and you're wondering if I'm talking about a boogaloo. Maybe, but I'm not convinced that that's the war that is coming. Now, here's what I mean by a war is coming. There is something that is stirring in the air, and it is something that has repeated itself throughout history. Now, you know the old saying that history repeats itself. For you sci-fi geeks out there, all that is happening has happened before and will happen again. Now, those are all things that we have learned as human beings throughout our existence tend to be repeatable patterns. When certain things happen, there's usually an effect, and that effect is usually along the same lines. Well, we've got all of the patterns right now of a war that is coming. Now, do I mean civil war? Not necessarily. I don't know where the war is. Sometimes you end up having these patterns, and the society, the leaders, the political class, whatever you want to call them, are able to channel that energy towards an exterior foe. Now, I've already said, if Biden ends up holding on to this thing, I've already told you, prepare for another war. There's going to be another war that is going to happen. And I wouldn't be surprised if we're looking at it being in Syria and that mess. But we don't know for sure. Again, that's if he holds on to this thing, because the election is not over in spite of what the media says. We'll talk about that on the radio show today. But I wanted to just kind of go over something. I don't know how many of you are into philosophy. I don't know how many of you paid attention to philosophy. Philosophy is interesting, but by and large, there are very few philosophers who have said anything of note that deserves your attention. But there are a few. And one of them is Julien Benda. And Julien Benda is a French philosopher. And in 1927, he wrote something you've probably heard of, but maybe you didn't know who wrote it. And maybe you haven't heard of it in a long time. He wrote something called The Betrayal of the Intellectuals. Some of you might know it as The Treason of the Intellectuals. It's the same piece. And in 1927, Benda wrote that, basically he was calling out the intellectuals of Europe, is what he was doing in 1927. Now, think about everything that's happening in Europe in 1927. Just think about that. You're coming out of World War I. You got all of these tensions that are building. Everybody sees what is happening in Germany. Everybody sees it. Few people want to react to it because of the horrors of World War I. But he wrote that the intellectuals of the day in Europe had abandoned truth, knowledge, the seeking of truth and knowledge. They had abandoned that. And what they had done is they had embraced a form of radical nationalism. And they have embraced anti-Semitism. They had embraced even racism. They had embraced these various forms of radical ideologies and abandoned truth and critical thinking and that sort of stuff. They just abandoned all of that, and they went towards hate. That's what he did. In fact, Benda actually called this the intellectual organization of political hatreds. Think about that. The intellectual organization of political hatreds. Now, this is in 1927. I know that some of you are probably listening to this right now and you're going, wait a minute, this sounds awfully familiar. Again, history repeats itself. So in 1927, he actually predicted that there would be a coming war, a great and coming war that would be the costliest man had ever seen. He accurately predicted World War II. And he predicted World War II not because he was some wizard or something, but he predicted World War II because of what he saw. He saw happening with academia in Europe. And he saw how they were completely abdicating their responsibilities to pursue knowledge, truth, call out what they were actually seeing happening in places like Germany. They just completely ignored all of that. And instead, they embraced this form of radical nationalism. Now, right now, what has happened is the political left, who are the actual fascists, they try to say that the political right are the fascists, particularly Trump supporters, are the fascists because they're nationalistic. Now, there is a huge difference between being a patriot and being somewhat nationalistic and being a nationalist. And there's a huge difference. And so what they're doing is they're basically convoluting the meanings of that, and they're mixing the definitions up. So they're basically saying that you're a fascist because you're a nationalist, but there's a huge difference between what we saw in the nationalism of Europe in the early 1900s versus the type of nationalism / patriotism that you see. So what they tend to do is they love to tell you that patriotism is actually nationalism when it's not. Patriotism is not nationalism. But they say that. And it's a convenient argument for somebody who is a pseudo-intellectual, who maybe has a handful of quotes on hand, but they don't actually understand what those quotes are, where they come from, or the historical context of them. Now, the reason I bring this up, what Benda said, and again, 1927, he predicted everything that was happening. And if you look at the university structure in the United States, it has been doing this for decades. Now, we go back to, let's go back 4.5 years ago. And we had the left in this country, who has a history of anti-Semitism and anti-Israelism. They ran around pretending that somehow there's this huge rise in anti-Semitic attacks, and they're all coming from people like Trump supporters, that Trump was an anti-Semite. None of which made any sense, none of which was true. Most of those ended up being fake hate crimes. But I always found that that was one of the most ironic things to be said, because it is, in fact, the left that hates Jewish people. And why you can't find Jews who will abandon the political left is beside me. There's this rich history there, and go figure. I don't know what to tell you. But on college campuses, anti-Israel, anti-Jew, that has been a mainstay. I've told you before about the time that I was invited by a student at a local college when I was on radio in Las Vegas, and they said, "I've got a teacher who I think is a terrorist." And so I went and I listened to this professor on a lunch period basically recruit for terrorist groups in the Middle East. And I'm listening to it. I'm going, this is insane that this is happening on an American college campus, but it was happening right before my eyes. I recorded a lot of it. I played it on my show. I was attacked by my employer for playing it on the show, in spite of the fact of what they heard this professor saying was undeniable. I didn't doctor anything. They just didn't like the idea that they were hearing this. And they certainly didn't like me calling it out on the radio. There is an old guard, if you will. Don't ruffle any feathers. Just go along to get along and that sort of thing. Whatever the crowd is doing, do that, because that'll get you the most ratings. So whatever you see the population doing, just make sure you blend in with that, and that'll help you get ratings. Don't stand out, that sort of thing. That's the old guard way of thinking. Obviously, those people are dinosaurs and they're dying out in this industry, but a few of them are holding on with a death grip, if you will. And, there's this rich history of anti-Semitism on college campuses. You walk down the school concourse. We've talked about this many times on the show. We've played you the videos, people carrying the Israeli flag and they're screamed at, yelled at, cussed at. You walk and you carry the ISIS flag and people were actually cheering you on college campuses in the United States of America. Many students on college campuses cannot wear the Star of David or they'll be verbally attacked, sometimes physically attacked. Now, that's the political left in the United States on the university campuses. That's not the political right in any way, shape, or form. And this has been going on for a very, very long time. And I pointed this out in one post, and I got people who I guess were new in politics, young people, are like, what are you talking about? Where's your evidence that any of this is happening? They were literally dumbfounded by this thing that has been generally accepted as absolute fact for over a decade in our society, that anti-Semitism and anti-Israelism is on college campuses in the United States. And it is, again, perpetuated by the left, not by the right. Now, why is this important? Well, this is important because you start running into things like what Benda saw in 1927. Saw this radicalism. Well, who are the people on college campuses that are the faculty? Well, they're mostly baby boomers. The baby boomers were influenced by Gramsci. Now, Gramsci, for those of you who don't know who Antonio Gramsci is, Gramsci was a guy that he's a philosopher. He hates Christianity. He's socialist, communist, Marxist, throw them all in there. Really horrible person. And he basically, he had a theory that you can't wait for the people, the workers, whatever, to rise up and take power for themselves, because that will never happen. It's just not in it for them to do that. So what you have to do is you have to attack the institutions of a culture. If you want to change a culture, you have to attack the institutions of that culture. Well, what are those institutions? The media, universities, the church. You attack those things. You attack education at the younger level than the university level. You attack all of those things. You undermine them from within. And what you do in society is you create mistrust of those institutions from society. Now, you look at what we have happening. Obviously, this goes hand in hand with Rules for Radicals and the 45 Communist Goals, which I've gone over with you before. And if you are at all a premium subscriber on Podbean, go back through those premium videos and you will find that stuff. You will absolutely find that stuff. But this is critical for people to just see these patterns, because what has happened? Well, our media has been discredited. Our universities have been discredited. Our education has been discredited. The church, they've all been undermined from within. And society itself doesn't trust them because of that undermining process that has taken place from people who have infiltrated those institutions. Well, with the media and universities, education, the law, church, all of those things are the bedrocks of our culture. Which is why a lot of Americans look around right now and go, what culture do we have anymore? American culture is quickly dying out. And that's because of multiculturalism, which is a part of this cultural revolution and relativism that we have kind of destroying our society and Europe's society as well. I mean, these are all critical things. And the thing is, we're seeing everything that happens. How many months now have I been telling you? It's probably been years, but I've really been hammering it over the past several months. How many months have I been telling you what we see with Antifa and BLM? And I'm sure that I went over this with Occupy and everything else that was going on in years past. Everything that they did, the strategy that they did, is exactly what the Nazis and exactly what the Bolsheviks and other groups before the fall of the Tsar did in Russia. It's the same strategy, the same exact strategy. Rules for Radicals was influenced by people like Gramsci and Nietzsche and these others. Rules for Radicals was influenced by these leftist thinkers. And ultimately, it was put together. These are what you go do. And it has been used. They used the successful strategies of many tyrants who have overtaken their governments in the past. And next thing you know, society has been completely changed. And it always happens with bloodshed. It always happens with war. It never happens peacefully. And to what extent that war ends up being, I mean, some cases, like in China, it's really, really horrendous. And in other cases, it's more of a small scale oppression as opposed to an outright war. Now, sometimes your political leaders can take that energy and focus on an external enemy. Sometimes. But I'm not sure that we're at a point where that can happen anymore, to be honest with you. We're at a point where terrorists who commit acts of terrorism in the United States are actually seen as sympathetic by many people on the political left in this country. It's not their fault that they're terrorists. It's our fault that they're terrorists. The ideology that made them terrorists is not real. It doesn't actually exist. They're yelling Allahu Akbar and They seem to know an awful lot about all of these things, but they're really mentally unstable. They're not actually terrorists. They're just, they're not really Muslim. I mean, how many times do you hear Obama say they're not really Muslim? They're fake Muslims. All right, well, the Westboro Baptist Church are Christians. They're just not good Christians, but they're Christians. And they're radicals. Not to the extent, obviously, of terrorism, but you start looking at all of this, and every single time this has been done, it's led to bloodshed, it's led to revolution, it's led to war. Every single time. And all of that is happening right now. The strategy is the same. The goals are the same. What they are doing is the exact same thing that we have seen play out over and over and over again throughout history. I just gave you an example of what, Europe in 1927. But we've seen this play out in Russia. We saw it play out in Germany. You realize that the Nazis and the Bolsheviks swelled their numbers on university campuses. That's where they got their dogma. The people who are there, again, going back to what Benda said, when Benda says the intellectuals at the university level, they abandoned European culture of seeking truth and knowledge. They abandoned that for what he called, the intellectual organization of political hatreds. They abandoned it for that. And then the students in their class were taught the intellectual hatreds. And then those students went out into the world and they joined the Nazi Party, they joined the Bolsheviks and whatever other radical group was there, and then they swelled their numbers on university campuses. Where do we see Antifa growing their ranks? On university campuses. And they're being taught this modern form of intellectual organization of political hatreds. They're being taught that by largely by baby boomers who have embraced people like Gramsci, who hates everything about Christendom and Western culture. Now you start looking at the patterns, and it becomes pretty clear at some point the powder keg that we know that we have been sitting on for some time now is going to fully ignite. And you could say, and some people have, you can say that with what we've been seeing with BLM and what we're seeing with Antifa and the violence that has been emanating from those groups, that maybe that powder keg has been lit, but not quite. There's certainly some sparks. You can also go back to the Bundy Ranch, some sparks there. You look at the Oregon Wildlife Refuge situation, some sparks there. Something's coming. What it's going to look like, I'm not exactly sure, but something is coming. Koala asks if it can be turned around. Well, let's look at history. When was the last time it was turned around in history? Can it be turned around? Maybe. Can the energy that we have be focused on a common enemy and unite us? I don't know that we have that. In Europe, at least when you had that radicalism and that nationalism, at least the French were nationalistic against other countries on behalf of their own country. We don't have that, though. So I honestly don't know. And I don't know what it's going to look like. I don't know how it's going to pan out. I don't know what the situation is ultimately going to end up, but something is coming. And maybe this election will be a catalyst for that. Maybe it won't be a catalyst for that. Maybe depending on the legal cases that are going forward, which we have a lot of updates on the radio show today. Perhaps that will explain something. I don't know. But there is an awful lot of evidence that is historically based and the patterns of what has happened historically that are happening at this very moment, and they have always led to conflict. They have never, not that I can find, and perhaps I am wrong, but I can't find a single example of all of these things happening where it didn't lead to some conflict somewhere. And those conflicts either change an entire country or they engulf the world. So we have to think about that. And I know that a lot of us we've joked and, well, okay, so this is the thing though, Koala. Look, Trump's legal cases are actually really strong. They're not frivolous. It's not like we're trying to recount a 10,000 vote deficit that doesn't make any sense just to see if he can get a couple of extra votes. There's people who are coming forward. They are entering their names into the system. They are willing to testify. They're naming the names of their supervisors. They've recorded some of it. We have timestamps on some of these things. We know that Trump has great legal cases in many of these regards. Now, here's the question, though, and I will leave you with this. Is it still possible that Trump is right and he loses? Yes, and it's possible that he loses legitimately. You have to, at the forefront of your thoughts, you have to have that out there. Just because he's right about 100,000 ballots in Pennsylvania doesn't mean he'll get enough of those 100,000 ballots to flip the state. Know what I mean? Is it possible? Absolutely. Is his case proven? Well, it looks like it could be. We'll see. But it is still possible for him to legitimately lose and still be right about what has been happening with the vote count. If the election flips back over to him, that becomes the rub. What happens with the other side who's been running around telling you there is no voter fraud and has been threatening you with violence for 5 years anyway? That becomes the big question. So we'll have to see. But if you look at all of the patterns, they point to conflict. Every single one of them. And I know that, yes, if you've never heard me sing this somber before, well, I mean, I do this somewhat regularly when I get philosophical about it. I don't go philosophical a lot, mostly because it's very somber. But there's a lot of evidence in history to be able to identify things. And everything that we have seen going back in history to the early 1900s is playing out right before our very eyes. What that looks like in the end, how horrible it ends up being, I don't know. But there is something coming, so be prepared for that.